Why hello everybody, welcome to another video, and today we're gonna go back to basics. But why? Well, in this series we tend to focus on the more advanced things. We talk about calculations, about more obscure mechanics that are difficult or sometimes impossible to understand just from the information that the game gives you. But knowing advanced stuff is useless if you don't know the basics. It's just not gonna make sense. Which is why today we're gonna go over the basics of elemental damage. So, there are 4 basic elemental damage types in the game: heat, electricity, cold, and toxin. Additionally, these can be combined with one another to create elemental combos, of which there are 6: radiation, blast, gas, magnetic, corrosive, and viral. Each of these has its own status effect, and it does different amounts of damage depending on the unit you are fighting. Because every unit in the game has some sort of quote-unquote flesh, which can then be protected by either armor or shields. Most Grineer units have cloned flesh, though they do have some machinery in there like rollers, which is either going to be protected by ferrite or alloy armor. Corpus, on the other hand, just have regular flesh, though they do have a decent amount of robotic units, those are your Moas and Ospreys, and they're protected by either regular shields or proto shields. Now Infested are a little bit special because they have 3 different health classes and an armor type. They have Infested, Infested Flesh, Fossilized, and then Sinew. And finally we have our newest faction, the Murmur, which is sort of a faction of 2 halves, because we have all the Rocky Boys, which are classified as the Indifferent Facade, but then we also have the Necramech units, which are at base machinery or robotic. It's basically the same thing that's protected by ferrite armor. This is why we use certain damage types against certain factions. If we take a look at the 4 basic elements, starting with cold, we can see that on the Grineer side it does more damage to alloy armor, which are the higher tier units like bombards and napalms. It does 50% more damage to corpus shields, which is what most corpus units use. Proto shields are only used by the highest tier of corpus. And it does 25% more damage to infested sinew, and this is a relatively niche subset of the infested. It's basically the Deimos specific units, zealot units, and the Hemosite. This does come at a cost though. It does 50% less damage to infested flesh, which is the lower tier units, and 25% less damage to fossilized units. Those are your ancients, broodmothers, and that kind of stuff. Basically the higher tier infested units. The cold status effect is very cool, pun intended. It stacks up to 9 times, and it can slow the enemy's attack and movement speed by up to 90%, whilst also making them take up to 50% more crit damage. So it's very good for crit heavy weapons, and it provides you with some crowd control. And finally it can be combined with heat to create blast, toxin to create viral, and electricity to create magnetic. Now one thing I want to point out here is that if you're using a damage type like cold, which does increase damage to armor, in this case alloy armor, and you strip away 100% of the enemy's armor, they lose that armor class and you lose the bonus damage. And while most of the time stripping away the enemy armor is preferred because armor provides a lot of damage reduction, especially at higher levels, it can sometimes be counterproductive because it will lose the bonus damage. Next on the menu we have electricity damage. This does 50% more damage to Grineer machinery, so mainly rollers, 50% more damage to robotic units, so Moas and Ospreys on the Corpus side, as well as Necramechs on the Murmur side, and 25% more damage to the Indifferent Facade, so the Rocky Boys from the Murmur. The downside is that it does 50% less damage to alloy armor, so bombards, napalms, that kind of stuff. The electricity status effect is absolutely stunning. It creates a Tesla chain that stuns the primary target and deals damage every second for 6 seconds to all enemies within 3 meters of the initial target. This stacks infinitely, but each prog has its own separate duration, so it gives you some extra AoE damage and it provides hard crowd control. And finally, it can be combined with heat to create radiation, cold to create magnetic, and toxin to create corrosive. Next on the menu we have heat damage. This does 25% more damage to the cloned flesh of the Grineer, so all the humanoid Grineer units, 25% more damage to the infested, which are some of the lower tier units, and 50% more damage to infested flesh, which is the rest of the lower tier units. The weakness here is against proto shields. This is used by some of the highest tier corpus as well as bosses. The heat status effect is quite hot, I don't have any more puns. It strips 50% of the enemy's armor, and then deals damage every second for 6 seconds. This also stacks infinitely, however, applying a heat proc refreshes the duration of all the previous ones as well. This is why you will sometimes see an enemy with 500 plus heat procs on them. Another interesting fact about heat procs is that the first heat proc you apply to the enemy snapshots the percentage amount of heat damage and faction damage you have on your weapon. So you can use a heat priming weapon of sorts that has maxed out heat and faction damage and then switch to a different weapon that has a proper build and can proc heat faster. But I digress. In general, heat procs strip a bit of armor and they provide damage over time. And finally, heat can be combined with cold to create blast, toxin to create gas, and electricity to create radiation. And last but definitely not least, we have toxin damage. Now, toxin damage does 50% more damage to Corpus flesh, so all the humanoid units on the Corpus faction, and 25% more damage to proto shields, which is used by the highest tier of Corpus and bosses. Now, this does come at a cost of doing 25% less damage to Grenier machinery, so mainly rollers, 25% less damage to robotics, so MOAs and Ospreys on the Corpus side, as well as Necramechs on the Murmur side, and 50% less damage to fossilized infested, so Ancients, Broodmothers, and generally the higher tier of infested units. Toxin damage, however, has a bit of an ace up its sleeve, because it bypasses all regular shields, meaning it's extraordinarily good versus the Corpus, because not only does it do more damage to their flesh, it also bypasses their primary defense. For the lower tier units anyways, as it does not bypass proto shields. Now, the toxin status effect is pure damage over time. It deals damage every second for 6 seconds, and it also bypasses shields. This further cements toxin as the go-to element when fighting Corpus. It also stacks infinitely, however, just like with electricity, each stack has its own duration. And finally, toxin can be combined with heat to create gas, cold to create vital, and electricity to create corrosive. Now, even though this might sound dumb, I want to make sure that everyone understands that adding elemental damage onto a weapon adds to the base damage of the weapon, regardless of status chance. Because I still remember not putting elemental mods on weapons with low status chance when I first started playing 11 years ago, because I thought you had to proc status to apply elemental damage. That's not how it works. The elemental damage is applied all the time. And it's very important, because while it might not be a multiplier, it increases the base damage you push through all the multipliers to get a big number at the end. The vast majority of weapons will benefit from adding elemental damage. There are only very few weapons, generally strong slash weapons, that are better off without elemental mods. Next on the menu we have mixing of those elements into elemental combos, because there's a certain way the game checks your mods to determine which combos you're gonna get. The order in which the game checks is the same as the order of precepts on companions, left to right, top to bottom. So if, for example, you want to run corrosive and heat, you first have to mix electricity and toxin to get corrosive and then put heat behind it. Because if you were to put heat up front, it would either combine with the electricity to create radiation or toxin to create gas. Also, innate elements on weapons are always mixed last, and they can and will be added into elemental combos that you build on the weapon. So if your weapon has innate electricity damage and you build corrosive, it's going to be added into the corrosive damage. But if you build vital and nothing else, you're going to get vital and electricity, and if you build for vital and put in a heat mod, you're going to get vital and radiation, as it cannot be combined with the mods that created vital, so it's going to combine with the heat mod to create radiation. Now, I know for a lot of you this is very basic information that you probably already know, but I would have loved this kind of explanation 11 years ago when I was just getting into the game. It answers the kind of questions that can sometimes make you feel stupid for asking them, but one thing you have to remember is that while it might make you look stupid when you ask the question, if you don't ask it, you're gonna look stupid every time it comes up and you don't know it. And as always, guys, I thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video and found it helpful, and if there is anything else you would like to add to this, feel free to leave a comment down below. Then I would also like to extend a special thank you to all the channel members. Thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate your support, and if you would like to become a channel member as well, by the way, you can check out the memberships and stuff down below. And I'll see you next time. Bye bye.